Welcome to Editor's Choice, Latin American Perspectives Book Conversations. My name is Alexander Scott. I'm the Outreach Coordinator for Latin American Perspectives and a member of the editorial collective.
I'm Tomas Crowder Taraborelli, a member of the editorial collective and co-editor of the media and film section.
We have a great show planned for you today, where we sat down with friend of the pod and LAP collective member Felipe Antunes de Oliveira to discuss his recent book, Dependency and Crisis in Brazil and Argentina, a critique of market and state utopias, published by University of Pittsburgh Press in 2024. Felipe Antunes de Oliveira is a senior lecturer in international relations at Queen Mary University of London and a coordinating editor at Latin American Perspectives. Outside the academy, he has served as a diplomat for the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as General Coordinator of International Financial Affairs at the Brazilian Ministry of Finance in 2024, and since December 2024, he has served as an alternate executive director at the International Monetary Fund. So, you spend a lot of time in your book unpacking the terms development and underdevelopment, and I want to get to dependency theory, but before we get there, I think we should touch upon this a little bit more, as well as Trotsky's idea of uneven and combined development. So I'm hoping you could just unpack for our listeners really generally what those terms mean and why you think it's important to revisit these terms in this work, specifically Trotsky's ideas around uneven and combined development. And then maybe we can get into how you synthesize those ideas with dependency theory in a few minutes.
Okay, so I think I will start answering this question from the end. So since the 1990s, there has been this big movement in development studies, post-development. And I'm thinking here of authors such as Steva, Escobar, and many others that have denounced development. And from this perspective, development is basically a discursive creation of Western nations to replace colonialism, to replace imperialism. And the idea is that instead of countries trying to civilize, as they were trying to do in the 19th century, after they become independent, they should try to achieve development. So development is just a set of Western ideas presented to the global South as something that they should achieve. Now, this post-development idea has some fundamental weaknesses, but it touches a nerve, I think. And I think we have been failing to engage with these ideas properly from a critical Latin American Marxist political economy perspective, right? Mm-hmm. So I had a series of conversations the last few years with left-wing neodevelopmentalists and even Marxists from Latin America. And they see those post-development ideas as actually another global North trick, saying, oh, we should give up development altogether, and that's convenient to the global North. And instead, what we should be trying to do is something like what China did, is trying to catch up and dethrone them and become the center of the world. So there's a whole debate here about what development is. Should be trying to achieve it? Should we not be trying to achieve it? I think, as I said earlier, I think all depends on how you define development, right? And the classical way of defining development is taking global North countries and taking them as a model. So the developed country is originally the UK, and then of course Germany and the US in the late 19th century. And those are the richest countries in the world. Those are the big military powers in the world. They are developed, they are ahead of us, and all other countries are behind them. And you can think of that as a horse race, every horse in their lane. And some horses started racing first, and the other horses have to catch up with them. The problem of this vision of development is that it's non-relational. So as if the UK started running without any relation to the other horses in the world, and the Germany and then the US. So the development process becomes an internal process of getting our productive forces together, getting higher productivity, achieving higher GDP, and then one day you become developed. It's very easy to see what is the problem with this, right? The world is not like that. The world is relational. So the development of the UK cannot be separated from slavery in the Caribbean. Development of Germany cannot be untangled from European politics and what was going on at the end of the 19th century. Development in the US is deeply related to neocolonialism in Latin America, so on and so forth. and also internal relations of production, right? The development happens through a lot of exploitation of internal working classes, and then eventually internal working classes reach some kind of understanding with their national bourgeoisies, as in the case of the UK or France, and then you happen to have you replace that internal exploitation for some kind of imperial colonial exploitation. So this is all to set the cards on the table and say that if development is understood at this horse race, is trying to catch up with the developed countries, is following their model, we'll never reach that because they achieve what they have achieved through a process of international exploitation. So it's impossible for all countries to do that, right? So this is just an empty objective. But at the same time, I do take into account what many people said, that we should try and be better. We should try and move society in the direction that we want society to move. And this is what the left-wing people that I've been talking about in Latin America mean when they say, oh, we can't give up development. So what we need then is a concept of development that allows for this idea that we should work to achieve a better world, to achieve what we want. And at the same time, development is a result of interactions at the international level and the class struggle at domestic levels. And that is where I come to the concept of uneven and combined development. Trotsky presented this idea originally with a different view, but I think we can find many elements in Trotsky's writings that allow us to redefine development, not as necessarily the outcome of more and more capitalist accumulation, but as the result of history, when you have class struggles interacting with international pressures and opportunities, and then actually things happening. And this is, if you think of it, if you read most of the uses of development, they already use development in this sense. Right? You have not the development of the means of production, but the development as in the things that actually happen in history. So this is this notion of development that I'm trying to present in the book. One way of saying the same thing is that I'm trying to have a non-moral view of development. So I'm trying to present development as if development is not something that we would necessarily try to achieve to become like someone else, but development is what happens when you have interactions between international forces and class struggle in a domestic level. Now, I know it's a bit of a complex concept, and I spend a lot of time in the book trying to unpack that and ground it back on Marxism and Trotsky's ideas. So I'm happy to develop some specific points of that. But a key idea is exactly that, is having a notion of development that allows us to tell a story and to express what we want to achieve, and at the same time does not reify global north countries as the models that should be emulated.
There is an enormous amount of poverty in the world everywhere. There is no system that's perfect. There's no system that's going to eliminate completely poverty in whatever sense. The question is, which system has the greatest chance? Which is the best arrangement for enabling poor people to improve their lot? And on that, the evidence of history speaks with a single voice. I do not know any exception to the proposition that if you compare like with like, the freer the system, the better off the ordinary poor people have been.
One of the goals of your book is to explore why Latin American governments have struggled to achieve long-term economic growth. As you write, the future never seems to arrive. Can you walk us through some of the main reasons behind this ongoing failure?
Thank you. I think, first of all, it's important to establish the failure, right? So we have in Brazil and Argentina, but also in most of Latin America, development discourses that go all the way back to the CEPAL school, the 50s and 60s, and many governments in Latin America always promising developments, catch up, becoming more like the US. The US is normally this big order that serves as an example. Of course, other governments have a more European inclination, but in any case, taking the global north as a model to be achieved. Now, the interesting thing is that Latin American economies do change and have changed a lot since the 50s and 60s. But if you compare Latin American economies and Brazilian and Argentinian economy to the US, for instance, we changed, but we did not catch up. So living standards are pretty much the same since the late 60s. As a proportion to the US living standards, right? So proportion of US GDP, we are more or less where we were 40, 50 years ago. So the question is, why can't we catch up? Now, this question was at the very beginning of my book. I started this research trying to answer this question. And then I, of course, very easily realized through my PhD research that I was really not the first person to ask this question. This is a big question for Latin American political economists. And if you think beyond Latin America, this is the question of political economy since Adam Smith. And then I quickly realized that this is a bit of a trap of a question, because we are already assuming that this is what we should be doing. We should be trying to catch up. We should be trying to become more like these economies. And we never become like them, so there must be something wrong about us. So what I try to do in the book is a bit change the parameters of the discussion, right? If you have the great majority of countries in the world trying to catch up since the process of decolonization and never managing to catch up, then what is the norm? Is the norm catching up, or is the norm not catching up? Right? So the normal thing is actually what is happening, is not catching up. And then we have a very few examples of countries that manage to catch up, and those are the exceptions, and those are the countries that should be explained, and they normally can be explained by geopolitical reasons, because it was important for the US or some other global north country to have an outpost, to have a safe haven for capital, so on and so forth. So my general conclusion at this broader political economy level is that we should start thinking of the global economy as non-converging. And that's how I come to uneven and combined development, and that's why I find dependency theory particularly useful.
You explore in your book how development projects often end up reinforcing dependency rather than overcoming it. And I think that's kind of what most people are concerned with. We have all these economies pitching all these, developmental projects and theories, but in fact, like what you said in our conversation, their lives are not better than they were 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. In fact, many lives are even worse. Can you explain how that actually happens in practice? How development can reinforce dependency? It seems like a contradiction, and I think a lot of people have trouble understanding that contradiction, or where we're investing, we're working so hard to develop the country, but actually I feel more dependent in my life. No?
Yes, this is what I call in the book uneven and combined dependency. So if development is the result of unevenness and combination, so if development is not necessarily converging to living standards of global north countries, then development can take many directions. And you can have developments that are actually negative, right? So what I want to do is to change the question of why didn't the countries develop, and having a more nuanced question that would be something like, why did the countries develop the way they did? And one way that countries can develop is developing while reinforcing relations of dependency. So what are those relations of dependency? They can take many, many different forms. So I'm the one that don't think that there is a unified dependency theory, right? There's a whole debate there in the 60s and 70s. Is there a unified dependency theory or not? I don't think there is a clearly unified dependency theory. What you have is a big reservoir of critical thinking, as later put it, as many other authors put it. I like to call it the Latin American School of International Political Economy. So we have many internal debates that stretch back to the University of Brasilia in the 60s, passed through Chile, passed through Mexico, and have a wealth of concepts that try to capture what this dependency means. For me, relations of dependency pin down to labor relations that are based on super exploitation of labor. So if you have a working class that does not get enough for self-reproduction, this is super exploited working class. And very interestingly and tragically, if you ask me, you can have a huge development of the forces of production in the sense of you can have huge economic growth, you can have changes in productive structures across sectors from agriculture to industry, back to some kind of modernized agriculture, and still have super exploitation of labor. Other traits of dependency, as Vanabambiha put it, are the dominated dominant ruling classes, right? Are ruling classes that are not interested in national projects of development. And you can see that in so many countries. In Brazil now, we have a whole debate about the tariffs that Trump imposed on Brazil. And you have part of the Brazilian ruling classes defending Trump. This is dominated dominant ruling classes right there. Right. So I think that what I'm trying to capture with this concept of uneven and combined dependency is the idea that you can have changes in the productive structures which are in my definition of development, some form of development. Of course, they are not the kind of development that people necessarily want. And this kind of development reproduces super exploitation of labor, reproduces a certain relation between ruling classes in developing countries and in central countries, and many other traits of dependency that you can see in the works of Ana Bambira, Teotonio dos Santos, Agustin Cueva, Marini, and many other authors of the 60s and 70s. Now, one thing that I found after I published the book is that there are other authors talking about uneven and combined dependency. So there is a very interesting article by Otero, Pelschner, and Gurkan that use this concept of uneven and combined dependency as well, this time to dialogue with Philip McMichael, this concept that he presents of mutual dependency. And they say, actually, what we have is an uneven and combined form of dependency instead of mutuality. So my conclusion here is actually that we have a wealth of concepts coming from this Latin America Marxist tradition, and you can use them to explain different developments, different changes in society, and understand them in a more complex way that is not just catch up or fail to catch up or fail of policies, but you can present a complex scenario in which development does not fall what you expect it to fall, but it happens anyway. So this is what I'm trying to capture with this concept.
So on this issue of uneven and combined dependency, like a big story that you tell in this book is really like the story of neoliberalism and neodevelopmentalism, and ultimately maybe the failure of both projects to bring about economic development and catch up with the global north, right? As a reflection of this uneven combined dependency. So I'd be interested to hear you speak a little more, like unpacking this maybe false juxtaposition or this juxtaposition of these two political economic projects, as well as you mentioned a few moments ago, like the class dynamics within Latin America that play a very specific role in supporting both of these projects. I was fascinated throughout the book, the different chapters on like the role of a national big bourgeoisie, the role of the middle classes, the role of like the downtrodden working class folks supporting different aspects of these projects. So yeah, kind of like a big question, but I'd be interested to just hear your thoughts on this juxtaposition and then between neoliberalism and neodevelopmentalism, as well as like the internal class dynamics and how they play a role here.
Okay, thank you. This is a big question, so I will tackle it in parts. First, a bit of a prelude. How did I come to this framing, right? So this book started in 2014 when I was starting my PhD research, and I was really deeply disappointed with the left in Brazil because the left did not seem to be able to present a project beyond neodevelopmentalism. So we were heading towards the presidential elections, and the candidates to the left of the Workers' Party, all they could say was, we will become more developed, we will have a very active state that will promote policies for social inclusion and industrial policies, and we will catch up and we will become more developed. So the left really fell into the neodevelopmentalist discourse. And I was particularly concerned about the political consequences of that, of the left abandoning more radical, more transformative, more socialist ways of thinking, right? And presenting their demands. Now, from 2014 to now, a lot of things happen, and these things happened while I was writing the book. So now developmentalism then appeared as the main thing that needed to be overcome and challenged. And by the way, there are many books that come from the same historical period. So I'm thinking here of Veronica Gago's book on neoliberalism, Madariaga's book on neoliberalism, right? They all come from this idea that we actually overcame neoliberalism in the 1990s. And now we have what they see as some new form of neoliberalism, what I saw as neodevelopmentalism, and this is what needed to be overcome. But actually, history went backwards. And we had the return of neoliberalism. And in some cases, we had the return of fascism. And this really complicated my narrative. And so what was originally intended to be a critique of neodevelopmentalism became a much more holistic critique of neoliberalism and neodevelopmentalism. So this is just to present the general scenario. Now, thinking about these terms specifically, neoliberalism, neodevelopmentalism, starting with neoliberalism. One big trap that we see a lot of critical scholars falling into is trying to define neoliberalism. Now, liberalism is something that is extremely difficult to define. And I spent years trying to define neoliberalism. And then I found a way out of it. And my way of thinking about neoliberalism is the following. You can define something from the general to the particular, right? So a bit in a Weberian way, think of ideal types. So you think of a general concept of something, general concept of neoliberalism. And then you look at specific cases of neoliberalism. And then the problem is that the specific cases never fit your general concepts. The other way of defining any concept or anything in the world is going from the particular to the general. If our listeners now are looking at a book, they can think of different books that they have seen, and then they can come to a general concept of a book instead of coming to the general concept of a book and looking for particular books, right? In this case, actually, our life becomes much easier because we know what is Latin American neoliberalism. So we have neoliberal governments that have been clearly identified in the literature, but also by social movements. So Menem is neoliberal, Cardoso is neoliberal, Macri is neoliberal, right? They are different forms of neoliberalism, but there's no question that they are neoliberal. So we have an object there, and then we can do the opposite way. We can look at the concrete cases and then try to abstract what is the general concept behind them. So this is how I come to my idea that in Latin America, neoliberalism appears as a development market utopia. They are trying to achieve development. If you analyze their discusses, which I do in the book to exhaustion, I look at tens of speeches by all of these presidents and their finance ministers. They present the ideas as a form to achieve development. And again, here the centrality of this concept of development. And they present this idea as trying to achieve development through unleashing the forces of the markets. And of course, they don't say that the states should be dismantled. They are not in any sense anarcho-capitalists. They are the second generation of neoliberals, if you want. They recognize that the state is very important to make markets work, but the markets are the driving force of development and catch up. So they should try and achieve this development by doing more and more neoliberal reforms, which are summarized in the Washington Consensus, but got to be updated by different governments, right? So here it's very easy to understand why this thing doesn't work, is because the work of freeing the market and making the market more perfect to achieve development is infinite. You can always do more and more reforms. There will always be something else to marketize and privatize. There will always be something else to deregulate. And you never achieve development. So you can always say, oh, we didn't achieve development because we didn't do enough of the neoliberal reforms. So this generates this kind of circular argument. We didn't get that because we didn't do enough, but you can never do enough of these things. So you generate this kind of thing that never materializes. The moment that we finish these neoliberal reforms, which we'll never finish, we will then achieve development, which we will never achieve. Now, the counterpart to this narrative is the neodevelopmentalist narrative. Different from neoliberals, neodevelopmentalists are proud of calling themselves neodevelopmentalists. And sometimes they don't like the term neo, but they call themselves new developmentalists or simply developmentalists, but they are not ashamed of being developmentalists. Quite the contrary, they are proud of it. And I'm thinking here of Bresser Pereira, is really the most prolific neo-developmentalist author, but you have a host of neo-developmentalist authors in Argentina, in Brazil, in Mexico. Have Kicillof, we have Andrea Roncaglia, we have Guilherme Melo, many of these people that are now actually in the government in Brazil, and that are brilliant. They are very good economists. They are clearly much better than the neoliberals. They know the things, they study the history of the countries. But what we can see in the ideas, in the most general sense, if we approach them critically, is this idea that you can have a state that finally gets the nation together, that overcome the class conflicts, that has this development mentality, this idea that we can catch up, and you get the right policies by overcoming the class conflicts, by getting everyone to work together towards becoming a developed country. You find this in speech after speech from finance ministers in Brazil and Argentina in the 2000s. And again, if you look at the speeches of contemporary Brazilian politicians, they are saying exactly that. It's like, as we understand that we have problems, we understand that we have challenges, let's get all together. Let's have the national interest at heart. Let's get the right reforms done. And if the state stands above the class conflicts, it can tame international forces and it can achieve development. So this is the neo-developmentalist ideology. Now, one thing that I want to make very clear, and really, luckily it hasn't happened, but I was afraid this would happen, that people would read my book as saying that neoliberalism and neodevelopmentalism are all the same. And I think that's one thing that I really want to make clear. And I think it's a big mistake that critics of neodevelopmentalism did right in the beginning of neodevelopmentalism 10, 20 years ago. They failed to see the differences between it and neoliberalism. And there are big theoretical differences, but most importantly, there are big class differences. And this hits your second question, Alex. They are based on different class coalitions, right? In the case of neoliberal governments, you have really the primacy of domestic financial sectors in association with international capital. In the case of neodevelopmentalism, you have this fantasy that you can get the whole nation together and then overcome the class conflicts. And most importantly, tame the national bourgeoisie. This national bourgeoisie that is not doing what they should be doing, which are development policies, but with the state, we can talk to them and make them see that they can compete in the world and become a developed country. So there is this faith in the national bourgeoisie, as if we will convince them that they should support the development project, and we finally get there. And again, to be fair, there are national capitals that are willing to embrace this project, at least in the short term, but doesn't seem to be the case for most of national capital in Latin America at all. Right? National capital in Latin America is really dominant. That is associated with international capital. So they are willing to play some form of nationalism as long as it is not against their interests for accumulation. What is wrong with neoliberalism and neodevelopmentalism? Both of them are circular. In the case of neoliberalism, you always expect more market reforms to achieve development, and development never comes. In the case of neodevelopmentalism, you always expect to build more state capabilities. You expect to hire more people for the state. You expect to get your act together to promote the right policies, but you never finish adopting the right policies. You never reach there, and then you never reach development because you never actually did the policy that you were supposed to do. So both are circular, and both, when combined, leave no space for other ideologies, because it's either you don't have enough market or you don't have enough space. So they reinforce each other, and they occupy the center of the political debate in Latin American countries, and they push away radical revolutionary alternatives. So the big work that I was trying to do in the book was to remind people that there were actually alternatives. If you look at political economy debates in Latin America in the 60s and 70s, there was a third alternative. There was a revolutionary alternative right there. So people saying this thing will not work, will never achieve capitalist catch-up development, and what we need to do is revolutionize our societies, change class relations, and change the way we deal with international pressures and opportunities, and have a different kind of international action, insertion in the world, in connection with African countries, in connection with so-called third world countries, now global south countries, right? So it's about recovering this third perspective that got pushed out of the mainstream debate by neoliberalism and neodevelopmentalism in the last 20 years.
To stay up to date on new issues, articles, and podcast episodes from LAP, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your preferred listening app.
Years ago, Argentina was climbing towards the first world, an up-and-coming country like Canada or Australia. Juan Perón, the military man who ruled Argentina in the golden years, built the country on the model used in Europe and North America, huge public works and a made-in-Argentina factory economy. The result was the most prosperous middle class in Latin America.
Fast forward to the 1990s and the reign of President Carlos Menem. He also transformed Argentina, but this time according to the rulebook of the International Monetary Fund. Menem imposed every business-friendly policy in it, all at one time. Downsizing, corporate handouts, and selling off every public asset he could find.
Yeah, along those lines, I'm really interested on the tail end of your answer. You mentioned in your book that there's a crisis in imagining developmental utopias, resulting in a lack of innovative proposals. You say no credible alternatives. Given that Brazilians and Argentinians seek protection from unemployment, illness, environmental disasters, what do you think economists and politicians can do to present proposals that genuinely inspire people to engage in social transformation for better lives?
Yeah, this question is a very tricky one because being very transparent with you, Thomas, I think we are not there yet, right? So if you look at the history of political economy ideas in Latin America, we had a moment of competing with liberal and developmentalist ideas and proposing policies, but we lost this momentum in the 70s and 80s, and we lost the middle of the debate. So the mainstream debate now is really in between neoliberals and neodevelopmentalists, to the point that we can't even think of policies that would be different from neoliberal and neodevelopmentalist policies, right? So I think the book is at a higher level of abstraction there in terms of reclaiming space for debates beyond market and states. And I don't go far enough as proposing specific policies. I do recognize that we should move towards that direction. So I think this is something that really should be the next thing. And I think part of the left in Brazil and in Argentina as well, but the example that I will give now comes from Brazil, have already noticed that. And they have been trying to find policies that challenge the core of dependency relations. And one key policy, for instance, is the reduction of the working hours. It's a classical demand from radical political economy, right? If you go back to the 19th century, now in Brazil, working hours are 44 hours a week. And there is a serious proposal to reduce it down to 36 or at least 40 hours a week. And this really goes to the heart of dependency because it attacks the very notion of super exploitation. It reduces super exploitation by reducing the working hours. So I think this is an example of a policy that can point towards something beyond neoliberalism and neodevelopmentalism. But we have to do much more work to find other policies. I think in terms of macroeconomic management and foreign policies, we have really our hands tied. So for macroeconomic management, anything that goes too far from neoliberalism, even in the neodevelopmentalist direction, gets a big market backlash. And we have to recognize that. So the correlation of forces is very, very favorable to capital for many, many years. So we first have to recognize this political reality before we can come down to the details of what are the policies that we would actually adopt if we had a different correlation of forces. So we have to deal with this correlation of forces first. That said, as I said, I'm actually hopeful because I'm seeing a different development discourse emerging. And the big example of that was the discourse of Pepe Mujica, right? Pepe Mujica doesn't fall easily into neoliberalism and neodevelopmentalism. It's a different kind of representation of development. And now we are starting to see new political, new policy ideas emerging, like the reduction of the working hours. I think a radical defense of the environment is also something that has the potential to go beyond neoliberalism and neodevelopmentalism, right? If you see concrete proposals for environmental destruction and a continuation of extraction, they actually unite neoliberal and neodevelopmentalist authors. So this is something that we can propose that goes beyond neoliberalism and neodevelopmentalism. But this will require another work. This is not what I do in the book, but I'm very interested in this line of thinking.
Yeah, especially when both Argentina and Brazil have faced, environmental crises, one in the southern part of Brazil, as you well know, with the floods, and now in Argentina, in Bahia Blanca as well. So I think people are realizing that climate change not only threatens their lives, but also the livelihood of their kids and probably their towns, their cities, their regions, no? So that could instigate, like you said, other ways of thinking about development that are not necessarily about exploiting the environment or, mining for natural resources, etc. That could open an interesting door for this type of discussion and reflection.
I think so. I think the most frustrating part of neodevelopmentalism is actually the environmental policies, which is something that I don't deal much in the book, but you can also see that reflected in foreign policies, which is more the focus of the book. In the best cases, like in Brazil, you have a divided state. So you give a tiny bit of the state to the environmentalists that can do their speeches, but they don't actually define macroeconomic and foreign policies. But at least they can say what they want to say. But when you actually have to take decisions about, I don't know, the big hydroelectric plants that they build in the Amazon or exploitation of oil in the Amazon, then in the end, you go back to this idea that we have to produce more and more and more. We have to accumulate more and more capital. We have to converge to the living standards of global north countries. And we will do that through a very active state that will get these policies together. We'll build things and eventually we'll get there. And we'll never get there, right? No matter how much you destroy the Amazon, you'll never get there by destroying the Amazon. So I think this is something that really shows a key limitation of developmentalism.
Kind of along those lines, or these issues of environmental degradation, extractivism, kind of taking a slightly different turn in the conversation, but I wanted to bring this up because I think it's an important part of your argument, and in conversations just between the two of us outside of the context of this podcast, I know you're really sympathetic to like the history of Eurocentrism in political economy and development studies. And I know this is an issue that's important to you and important to sort of left-wing scholarship in general right now. So, like, what contributions do you think, like, indigenous and Afro-descendant traditions, scholarship, thinking offer to the future of development strategies, whatever that might look like moving forward?
Okay, thank you. I think this is such an important question. So in a way, this post-development literature that emerged in the 90s and the 2000s tries to channel some kind of indigenous critiques of capitalism, right? And of course, you can criticize them exactly for that. In the end, you were talking about a few white, mostly male academics based in global north institutions trying to talk about Pachamama or the nature or channeling concepts of indigenous people. And I can see this as very problematic, as many of the works of for instance, Boaventura Sousa Santos, right? There's something deeply contradictory that hero of anti-colonialism in Brazil is the Portuguese white man, right? But that said, they played an important role in placing this debate in the mainstream. And I think what we have to do now is go further, right? Go deeper and try to understand then what are the cosmovisiones, the different visions of the world that these cultures try to promote, and understand really having this anthropological, how can I put this humility. Does this word even exist in English? Am I inventing a word? I do that now and then. So having this anthropological notion that what is valued under a certain system of values that gets reproduced in contemporary Western cultures is just one way of seeing the world. And you can have many other ways of seeing the world. And we actually have a lot to learn from other ways of seeing the world and representing what is abundance, what should be achieved in life, right? So I think this is one thing that is behind my critique of development in a way. Although I don't engage that much with indigenous scholars, I think this is a bit behind my critical view of development and what I try to achieve by thinking of development in a different way and claiming that development should be defined by social movements, by people that actually want to define their own futures. But I think there is something that is even more visible that in Brazilian and Argentinian political economy in the last few years, which is the emergence of Black movements in Brazil. And there's a whole new literature of Black authors really placing the centrality of slavery in the formation of the country and how social hierarchies that come from slavery continue to this day. And by feminist authors in Argentina. So in Argentina, it's really amazing how the feminist authors found a way to criticize political economy that is very, very original. Thinking again of Lucy Caballero, Veronica Gago. They really point a way to criticize neoliberalism beyond our normal developmentalist critique, right? They see neoliberalism as creating this kind of subjectivities that are particularly problematic for women. And they actually build a social movement that was instrumental in getting the Macri government defeated. So I think the book makes a point of engaging with contemporary anti-slavery, anti-colonial literature in Brazil and the feminist literature in Argentina, seeing those emerging forces beyond neoliberalism and neodevelopment. So when I try to find an alternative, I really take a lot from this literature. And here we have a connection with the previous question from Thomas. This is an insurgent literature that shows deep divisions within Brazilian and Argentine society, but that does not necessarily come up with policy alternatives, right? So we are at the phase of really screaming neoliberalism and neodevelopmentalism are not enough. We want to go beyond that. And they are based on social relations that are deeply problematic for being racist, for being patriarchal. But what we have to do then is reimagine what is a development project that we would embrace and that would be able to accommodate for this deep fact that colonialism still marks and patriarchal domination still defines societies in Brazil and Argentina. Just to connect it to dependency, I have one article where I try to make this connection between anti-racism and feminism and dependency. And I'm happy to see many more articles coming up now. Belén Viegas has been writing a lot about it now and really like her stuff. I think that, as I said before, a key trait of dependency is the super exploitation of labor, right? Is the idea that you can play the working class below that level of reproduction. And this is something that many Marxists are not willing to accept, because it seems a direct contradiction of Marx's theory of value. And they make a very sensible point, which is, if you are paying the working class below their level of reproduction, they will die. So how is it even a possibility to have super exploitation of labor? And then you have to remind these Eurocentric Marxists that actually behind the level of reproduction in the market, there are forms of reproduction that are beyond the markets. So you have the exploitation of female bodies, you have the exploitation of Black bodies, not through the market relations, right? So what makes possible for a male worker to be super exploited is that there will be a woman cooking for him at home, taking care of the children at home. So you have a whole layer of non-market relations of exploitation, mostly of female and Black bodies, that make possible this relation of exploitation. So I think this is how you connect these notions of super exploitation and female oppression and anti-Black racism in Brazil. And they all come together. So I think a big challenge for critical authors in Brazil and Argentina today is really fully taking these voices into account instead of making them a footnote and say, oh, look, there are also feminist and Black voices. Is really integrating them into a more holistic political economy perspective. And this is what I try to do in the book a little bit.
Estamos frente a un verdadero conflicto frontal sobre las grandes corporaciones transnacionales y los estados. Estos aparecen interferidos en sus decisiones fundamentales, políticas, económicas y militares por organizaciones globales que no dependen de ningún Estado y que en la suma de sus actividades no responden ni están fiscalizadas por ningún parlamento, por ninguna institución representativa del interés colectivo. En una palabra, es toda la estructura política del mundo la que está siendo socavada. Las grandes empresas transnacionales no solo atentan contra los intereses genuinos de los países en desarrollo, sino que su acción avasalladora e incontrolada se da también en los países industrializados donde se asientan.
So my last question is about dependency theory. What can young scholars and activists interested in political economy learn from the works of dependency theories like Marini, Bambira, and Dos Santos that you already mentioned in our conversation?
Yes, this question actually invites me to talk for half an hour about dependency theory, but I will refrain from doing it at this moment. I think what is very important to keep in mind when we're studying dependency theory is that those guys, Marini, Dos Santos, Gambira, but also Agustin Cueva, also Fernando Henrique Cardoso, right? I think we tend to see him as a different part of the dependency tradition for a good reason, but engaging with his work is always valid. And many others, they belong to a very different moment in Latin America. They belong to a moment in Latin America when revolution was possible. So one way of seeing dependency theory is as an intellectual justification or an intellectual development of ideas that were present in the Cuban Revolution, for instance, and that later appeared in the government of Allende. It's exactly this idea that we can find alternative for Latin America that is not becoming like global north country, not getting richer and richer and then exploiting some other part of the world and becoming part of the core, right? Had absolute clarity about that. They saw it and say, this development that they keep promising, A, is not possible, and B, we don't want it. We don't want it. So if you try to keep achieving it, you always end up in this dead ends of theories that are circular, that never achieve what they pretend to achieve, and always fall back to little policy mistakes. And dependency writers were way above that. They were saying it's really not about policy failures. We are not even engaging in these little policy failure debates. And also have this prospect of changing societies in a radical way that was not just copying the Soviet Union either. Right? So they have really a clear, non-aligned vision of what they were trying to achieve, much similar to what the Cuban Revolution was in the early days and what Allende tried to achieve. So, we are not trying to reproduce the Soviet Union. Here we have our own path towards socialism, towards communism, towards the emancipation of our people, and you reclaim this space. Now, by making these political debates within academia in the 60s and 70s, dependency writers really produced a lot of wonderful works of history and sociology and economics, and they came up with a wealth of concepts. What I think survives after 50 years are exactly those concepts, because the political situation today is very, very different. And we should keep on aspiring to change things radically, but the correlation of forces, as I said, is very different, right? So what we can look at what they did is really trying to recover these key seminal concepts. And one that I keep using is the notion of superexploitation of labor. Also, this notion of dominated, dominant ruling classes, which is a devastating critique that Vane Bambia does to Cardoso and to other authors that come close to a developmentalist tradition, saying, look, you are supposing that you can convince this national bourgeoisie that it's good for them to go for a developmentalist project, but they will never accept this. And Teotonio dos Santos also has many very fruitful concepts. I use the concept of dependent or peripheral fascism from him, but he has many other ideas. So my recommendation to a new generation of scholars trying to approach dependency theory is really trying to read it with an open heart. You don't really have to buy into the political debates of the moment there. And you should be able actually to abstract from that. It's a bit like reading Marx, guys. If you're reading Marx, in many cases, you think like, why is he criticizing this guy specifically? Or what about this local debate here? And those were important. If you can understand the context, your reading gets much deeper, but they go beyond that. They create concepts that can be used in different occasions. And I think many of the concepts that appear in the works of Marini, Dos Santos, Gambira, and others can be used today. This concept of peripheral or dependent fascism, for instance, I think is really worth revisiting at the moment. It's really something that we have now, and shows, again, that fascism is not a specific historical event. It is a sociological concept, and we can use it for different countries and different occasions, and really helps understanding Bolsonaro and even Milei today.
I want to clarify just one quick point that you made. You said the economic conditions are very different from what they were where they were writing dependency theory. Is that because you see the world, and many economists argue this, more integrated globally in terms of the flow of money, of commodities, et cetera, et cetera? Is that the key issue, the increased integration of the global market? Because I feel like a lot of people don't really feel that their lives are more integrated. They face the problems that they used to face before, like bad transportation, increasing the price of food, schools in ruins and things like that, bad healthcare. So how do you kind of resolve that contradiction in the way people experience things? We're more integrated, but I still have the same problems I had before, in a sense.
So I think there are three things here. First one is the world being more integrated. And I'm noticing here that we are avoiding the word globalization, as I think we should, because it's a beautiful, empty word. But there is something there, right? So I think that is the national markets are way more dependent on international connections. So this is one aspect of it. The other aspect is the absence of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union really played a key role, although the vision was not reproduced in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union demonstrated in world politics that a different world was possible. And now we don't have this effect of demonstration. China is a whole totally different story, right? So I think this is one big thing. And the other thing is the momentum for decolonization in Africa and the rest of the third world. So they were writing in a moment that it was really the end of empire. It was clear that empire could not hold the colonies anymore. It was a moment of empowerment of people in the so-called third world. And it's different from where we are now. We had the backtracking on all of this. So the conditions are different. But I think in the end, these three conditions that I just mentioned, the fact that national markets were less integrated into international markets, the presence of the Soviet Union, and the decolonization moment, they created an illusion in many social activists, revolutionaries, scholars, radical scholars in the global south. They created again the illusion that national revolutions were possible. And the Cuban Revolution seemed to demonstrate that. Yeah, it's possible. We can do a national revolution. But then Trotsky came back after 2-3 decades. And we see now clearly that national revolutions are not sustainable. National revolutions can only serve to sparkle global revolutions. And if they don't sparkle global revolutions, then the revolutionary country quickly enough hits a wall and cannot keep its revolutionary process, right? So I think this is the condition that we are now. I think we cannot afford to be innocent anymore, and we have to understand that revolutions have to be international, right? So the prospect of national revolutions that was behind the works of Marini, dos Santos, and Mobiado, what they are trying to do was the Cuban Revolution in Brazil and in other Latin American countries. That prospect doesn't stand anymore, unfortunately. We cannot aspire for a national revolution anymore. What we can aspire is to create networks that would allow for revolutions to emerge in different parts of the world in a coordinated way so that we can overcome the capitalist system altogether. So we are in the new Trotskyist moment, if you like. And I think this is one of the reasons why these authors were skeptical of Trotsky, because they were in a moment that Trotsky seemed less relevant because the national revolutions were happening. But then we saw what happened. These national revolutions never managed to create a different world. So if we are going to create a different world, we have to follow a more internationalist strategy, I think.
Well, that is all the time that we have for today, but thank you so much for tuning into the show. Dependency and Crisis in Brazil and Argentina is available for purchase at upitpress.org. Check the show notes for links to where you can order a copy. To stay up to date on new issues, articles, and podcast episodes from LAP, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your preferred listening app. If you're a student, academic, or activist interested in Latin America, or simply someone who just wants to engage with the most in-depth and well-researched scholarship on Latin American politics, political economy, society, and culture, please consider subscribing to our journal. Annual print subscriptions start at $74, and we offer discounted rates for students and members of the Latin American Studies Association. In a moment marked by the rise of right-wing authoritarianism, the erosion of independent publishing, and the broader decline of print and academic media, supporting journals like Latin American Perspectives is more important than ever. Your subscription helps sustain a critical space for internationalist, anti-capitalist, and decolonial scholarship. We'd really appreciate your support. Hasta la próxima. Gracias.